Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Travel Vault webinar. My name is Christina Brazier, and I'm the Operations Director of the Travel Vault. And today I'm joined by Martin Alcock of the Travel Trade Consultancy and Chris Wright of Sunvil. And I'm hoping to be joined by Farina Azam of Kemp Little very shortly. As usual, all attendees are muted for a better sound quality, but we welcome any questions to the panelists. So please use the Q&A function in order to pose your question to them. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel later today. So whilst we're waiting for Rena, I will actually ask Martin if he could start off today. So Martin, I mean, over the last few months, you provided us with a regular outlook of the main issues and how the industry and consumers have reacted to COVID-19 and how we can indeed bounce back. I believe you're now going to continue to kind of bring us up to date on that and highlight some of the challenges and risks for us. If you wouldn't mind sharing your screen.
Yeah, no problem. Morning, everyone. Thanks for that, Chris. So I have promised myself and my colleagues that I will do my best to be as positive as I can, because it's a real challenge at the moment out there, and I guess you don't really need me to tell you that. But what I thought I'd do is just share with you, I guess, a few bits of information that we're seeing that kind of indicate the position we're in. Just talk a little bit about a cliff edge that I think a lot of the industry is facing at the end of September, actually, and then just try to just checking. Can you see the right screen there, guys? Is that can you see the presentation? Or you can't see my kind of,
yeah, we can see your presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, because I think there is a bit of a cliff edge, but equally there are some areas we can start to look at. I think to de-risk businesses and to try to start to build that trust again with clients, which I think there's some opportunities there. So I think start with some positive news. I mean, this is a slide that we put together actually a few months ago now, and it was based on kind of anecdotal data and conversations with clients and things, but it was trying to sort of show what we thought the return to some sense of normality might look like, and we split it kind of crudely between domestic holidays and international, and you can see that was starting back in May, running through June, July, up to February next year. So actually we are tracking, and again, latest anecdotal information we're getting, we are tracking quite closely to this. I think if anything, domestic bookings amongst clients we're talking to seem to be trading slightly better than this. That does seem to have come back much more quickly. International, I think there's a real mix, certainly between European and long haul. European does seem to have come back a bit more quickly, and I mean, this chart was expecting that back in May time we'd be somewhere around 50%, and I think that is kind of what we're hearing from people selling European product. I think the long haul market is a lot more challenging and is maybe a little bit behind that, but it certainly suggests that we're kind of broadly on track. 50% down compared to where you normally would be is still pretty terrible pretty horrible by most standards, but at least it's moving in the right direction. A couple of the data points for you. This is this website heat map put together by Citibank, and it effectively measures consumer kind of behavior or people looking on websites for a variety of different travel verticals. So pick a few out there. You can see that from the dark days of April, hotels are now kind of 53% down compared to 78% down. Tour operators and travel agents, you've got Love Holidays, On the Beach, TUI on there amongst the cohort. They're down sort of 47% versus where they were a few weeks ago at 70% to 80% down. Airlines showing an improvement. No surprise that cruise lines still kind of flatlining at that sort of 69% down. And I think in a large part because of the FCO advice surrounding that. So certainly it's starting to trend in the right direction. It's certainly moving forward. Similarly, there's a bit of data here on departure takeoffs for 4 of the major European airline groups, and you can see that latest column there is for just last week. And it is this kind of steady improvement, steady kind of move in the right direction. But I mean, that's certainly not to suggest that we're anything like out of the woods yet. There's a real sort of dangerous path ahead, and I think in many ways, I feel like this opening up period is more dangerous than the close down. In some respects, the close down was a much more simple equation. It was there's no money coming in the door, so you stop as much going out as you can. and not that that's easy, I certainly don't mean that, but it's simple to get your head around. I think the opening up is much more complicated because the minute you make a decision to start opening up, you obviously start incurring more costs, but there's just so much uncertainty as to what that sort of next few weeks and months look like. Just a few examples. I mean, this is an example from a client of ours that runs river cruising. So they're trying to get their program restarted. They're trying to run Danube cruises. They're looking at those that government list of air corridors, and their river cruise dips into Slovakia for about 5 miles. But because of that, Slovakia not being on the corridor list, that means either passengers have to isolate for 14 days when they get back, or they drop Bratislava off the list. But well, straight away you then are into issues potentially around is that what you sold the client? Do they have a right of compensation for you missing out destinations? You then factor in that this cruise is scheduled to cross the border into Austria around 7 days into the cruise, but Austria currently requires a valid COVID-free certificate less than 4 days. So they're trying to manage, how do we run these tests on board to allow this to happen? And this is just one little anecdote of some of the complexities, and I'm sure everyone on this call can attest to something similar. I think there's this ever-present threat, though, of another Leicester, another Barcelona. I mean, there was rumours circulating yesterday that Rome might head back into some sort of lockdown. Barcelona isn't officially in lockdown, but that seems more like semantics to me. It seems like it's all but kind of in name. There's the ever-present threat of failures. You know, certainly in my work, I'm spending a lot more time talking to administrators and insolvency practitioners than I would care to normally. And you know, sadly, we've seen the loss of a number of long-standing, you know, trusted brands that up until 6 months ago, in some cases, were very profitable, very good businesses. And this crisis just, I guess, has no respect for any of that history. It's really horrible to see, and in some cases, real close friends that have battled to the end to keep that business going and ultimately been unsuccessful. I think the inevitable conclusion of those sorts of uncertainties are what we see in this slide. This is IATA's data just from a week or so ago, showing that of the departures that are taking place, something like 40-odd% of them are being booked just 3 days before departure, compared to on what normal levels might be something like, you know, less than half of that. I think, you know, you don't need me to tell you that no business, whether you're an airline or a tour operator, wherever you are, can run with a 3-day window from the point of view of scheduling and resourcing and all those sorts of things, completely unsustainable. It's an obvious reaction to customers who are nervous about financial health of the company they're booking with, as well as, can I actually get there? Will I be locked down? Will I be even to leave the house when it comes to it? And it's not just the consumers that are nervous. You know, all of the stakeholders that we are working with are all kind of displaying similar kinds of traits. You know, all of the people on this slide, whether they be the regulators or the kind of service providers, are all looking at their position and trying to do the maths on what they think their risk is. And we're starting to see some noise coming out. So IATA, for example, are very close to announcing their final position on what the relaxed rules will look like. They will give some kind of slightly kind of relaxed rules on their financial criteria, which will help some. But there's just this ever-present threat, and it feels like we're sleepwalking into it a little bit, that whether it be, you know, in the bond markets, whether it be credit card facilities, there are stakeholders just unwilling to continue providing services, and that is starting to crunch. It does feel like we are kind of heading to this cliff edge of the end of September. I think there's a number of things that all come to fruition at the end of September. So there is an ATOL renewal, and obviously to an extent, many on this call will be kind of insulated to an extent because the Travel Vault will assist with that. But many in the market are looking at that ATOL renewal and just kind of wondering how the CAA will be able to manage it. You know, logistically, their usual tools in their armory around taking security through bonding, if they're not comfortable with finances, don't seem to be available. You factor in things like they're a government organisation that isn't geared up to be working from home, so they're grappling with the same challenges, if not more than the rest of us. You add to the fact that when they renewed most of the large operators in April, what they did was introduce an extra condition that said, you've got a license, but you have to come and kind of prove that you're still viable sometime over the summer to get that license continue. They've effectively got a full March renewal and a September renewal to do at once, and all the while they have all of these businesses on an intensive care list that take up lots of resourcing to sort of manage. So a really difficult position from a regulatory position. I think September, we head into the last month of the availability of the furlough scheme, and of course employers start to have to contribute more. And I guess we'll also have one eye on end of furlough at end of October. Do we need to start, if we haven't already, making people redundant? So these eye-watering figures of these poor people who've been made redundant in the industry, you expect that will increase and maybe kind of ramp up as we get closer to that date. I think then, and it would be really interesting to get Farina's view on this later on, because there was a insolvency bill introduced by the government in June, and it did a number of different things to just take the pressure off businesses and owners. Two things in particular were one, a moratorium on the ability of creditors, unpaid creditors, to issue winding up petitions and make statutory demands. And that's really important, because what we'd seen in that early days of those refund credit note scenarios, where customers, particularly the more kind of clued up customers who were desperate to get their money back, were going down that route of issuing statutory demands through the courts to have businesses wound up. And this bill introduced a moratorium on that to prevent creditors from being able to do that, but that time limit was up till the end of September. Similarly, that bill introduced a relaxation of the rules around wrongful trading. So directors running businesses in normal times or have a fiduciary duty not to trade whilst knowingly insolvent. And obviously in a crisis like this pandemic, very hard for any directors to exactly know what the future looks like. And so that relaxation of those rules meant directors could, it was one less thing to worry about, but that does come to an end at the end of September. And I think really it's uncertain for me what that looks like, because from the 1st of October, you suddenly have a position where potentially creditors can go back down that old route of winding up petitions. But more importantly, as director of a business, if you're trading whilst there's no realistic prospect of your business surviving, suddenly you have to proactively put the business into administration and take steps to stop that. And, in the worst case, if that was carrying on was deemed to be fraudulent, that is a criminal act. So hopefully we see either an extension or more relaxation of that, but these number of different issues that all come together at the end of September. So just turning attentions to the bounce back and what we can do to manage risk and to try to build trust a bit more. I think just a few ideas. Some of them will be relevant to some businesses on this, but maybe not all. I think the first thing is to really, look hard at your structure from a commercial perspective. And let me just give you one example of this. So broadly speaking, you can act as a principal in a transaction, or you can act as an agent. And we see a lot of businesses that have a hybrid model where in some cases they will act as the principal and in others they will act as the agent. Now, there's lots of reasons why you might choose one over the other, and too many to go through in this presentation. But just one very recent example of two companies I'd spoken to who were reselling effectively the same product. It was a simple cruise from a cruise line. One was acting as the principal, so contractually taking all of the reward for that, being able to control pricing and maybe manage additional profit margins, etc. But was contractually the principal, responsible therefore for what happens. Another business selling exactly the same cruise, but doing it as a retail agent, where the contractual position is actually that it's the customer in contract with the cruise line, and the agent is merely just putting the two together. Now, when that cruise line then failed, those two businesses have very, very different costs to incur, and suddenly that principal, who maybe was earning a bit more from a profitability point of view, now has all of the cost and the responsibility of replacing or refunding customers. Potentially catastrophic, though hopefully not, and hopefully they can rely on insurance and things. So now is the time to maybe look at what you're selling, and there definitely will be instances where maybe it makes more sense to act more like an agent than a principal. But again, there are a raft of other considerations beyond just this, but certainly it's something you should look at. Just quickly on the subject of agents, one of the issues that became clear after the Thomas Cook failure was that travel agents, the Thomas Cook retail agents, were collecting way more money from customers on behalf of tour operators than the tour operators knew about. So very briefly, contractual position is the customer is in contract with the operator, the agent is acting for the operator. And this money here is the pipeline money. This is where agents have collected it, but not necessarily passed it on. And so what happened was, in that instance, Thomas Cook were collecting way more pipeline money, but not passing it on until much further down the line. And so when the failure happened and the tour operator thought they were only in for, say, £100 deposit, they discovered that actually the full £1,000 had been paid 2 months ago, and actually the operator was therefore responsible for the full 1,000. One of the things that ABSA came out and said after that was very few, if any, agency contracts actually had any clauses in there that prohibited the agents from doing that. Clearly there was a moral point, but there was nothing in law you could point to say that they breached their conditions. And so we did see some operators rewriting their agency agreements to specifically include clauses on this. Agency agreements generally, if you are acting as agent for other ATO holding operators, there is a regulation around those agency agreements, and you should make sure they're up to date. But I think if you're an operator selling through agents, you really should take another look at your contractual position and make sure that you do have some limitations on what those agents can do. Another area you could look at to manage risk is introduction of payment via corporate credit card. So when you as a business pay a supplier using a corporate credit card, you actually have exactly the same rights and availability of compensation as a consumer does when they have the right to charge back. And so where possible, if you can pay using a corporate credit card, it is a little bit of a proxy for supplier failure insurance. The big issue for smaller businesses tends to be acceptance. So a lot of large suppliers won't accept corporate card because there is a cost to them in accepting that. But times are definitely changing. I think the absence or the sort of lack of availability of supplier failure insurance is maybe making some of the operators more willing to accept these sorts of payments. But again, certainly a conversation to have. I think another area just to look at trying to de-risk, again, it's an obvious one, but cash flow profiles or seasonal cash flow profiles do represent a very high risk at the best of times. You know, this is a typical cash flow profile for a summer holiday operator, where all of the peak is in that summer period as you're collecting your final balances. I think to make a concerted effort to look for strategies that can just raise those shoulder months and try to flatten out that cash flow profile. It's not easy, clearly, but to have that as a concerted effort, because I'm hearing a lot of operators at the moment are saying things like, how does my business survive 3 consecutive winters? You know, summer has been virtually wiped out, and this is the issue. When a big issue happens right in the middle of your busy season, it potentially is catastrophic. So the kinds of things you could look at are, you know, introducing counter-seasonal products, acquisitions, and I think in the wider sense of the word, you know, there are undoubtedly opportunities to pick up, you know, through buying other businesses, but that's much more of a risk. I think acquisition of sales staff who have maybe got more experience in selling, say, winter products if you're a summer operator, you know, ski products if you wanted to kind of try and introduce them. There are opportunities to bring in new members of the team to try to flatten out that profile. Revised payment terms, again, it's a very challenging environment right now to be given everything we've just said about nervous consumers to try to get them to pay early, but clearly it has a benefit, and so something to try to work towards. It's worth considering. One thing we're seeing a lot of, and I guess it falls into that first bullet point, is this idea of operators launching UK products. So here's 4 examples of fairly large tour operators launching a UK and Ireland portfolio. And again, I think that the overlooked benefit of this, I think certainly we work with some of these guys, and speaking to them privately, they're not necessarily expecting a queue out of the door of people who would normally buy their cottage from, you know, holidays.com or whatever, suddenly coming to Cooney to buy a UK cottage. But I think the overlooked benefit is actually where you've got customers cancelling, and anecdotally roughly 70% of them will accept a refund credit note, but 30% will demand the cash back. If you've got a UK product up your sleeve that you can say, well, how about switching into this? It maybe reduces that 30% who demand cash down to 25 or 20%, and that is ultimately margin saved and cash not going out of the door. So it's possibly more a tactical thing than necessarily a pivot of the business model. And so if you think of it through that lens, actually, it makes far more sense. A couple of things just in this idea of building trust. You know, I think The one thing I'm convinced of as we start to improve through all of this is that the role of a trusted advisor, whether that be a traditional travel agent or just a trusted brand who's owning their particular space or their particular product, I think will become far more important. I mean, just some examples on here. You have FCO advice, which is continually changing. We're expecting another update on air bridges and corridors, maybe even I think Monday next week, and talk of, for example, Portugal suddenly it not being a country on the list, it might be regional. The flip side being certain regions of Spain, there are rumours that parts of Spain that have seen an uptick in cases maybe would be taken off. So not Spain as a whole, but just certain parts. It's a very complicated sort of arrangement if you're a consumer trying to unpick this. I think we'll see a lot more of this news story that got a lot of coverage. A family on a love holiday that turned up to their hotel to find it was still closed. Undoubtedly, you'll see more of that confusion as things open up, the Barcelona lockdown we've mentioned. So definitely a role for a trusted advisor more than ever. I think the other thing you've definitely seen is this pivot of marketing message. You know, there's just 3 examples on the board there, but this is the cooperative agent group that are, everything is about flexibility. We promise we'll refund you within 10 days. You can change within certain time periods if something goes wrong. COVID cover insurance products are being introduced. It's all about the flexibility. All of the marketing messages are about that. And so certainly something to bear in mind as you're doing the same thing. In keeping with this idea of building trust accounts as a sort of product have had a huge amount of press coverage, and I have to say not all of it accurate. Trust accounts are useful and do tick many boxes, but they aren't a panacea for this crisis. Lots of companies who run trust accounts and maybe publicly are saying they've performed better really are having some of the same issues. You know, if an airline has been paid and isn't paying you back, then you might have the balance in the trust account, but you certainly don't have the 100% of the money to pay back to clients. But nevertheless, they're certainly getting more traction. Now, I think whether that sort of lasts long term beyond this crisis is debatable, but there's a good habit to get into. There's a full trust account, which again, probably we don't have time to go through in detail here, but there's quite a lot of complexity, quite a lot of cost to running that full trust account. But actually as a halfway house, something like a client account is worth considering, I guess, for a smaller business. Really what that means in practice is maybe right now you have one single bank account that all of your money flows in and out of, and so your own company funds are co-mingled with your clients' funds, and you're paying your rent and your staff costs all out of that one account. I think as a good first step, a good discipline is to just have a simple separate bank account. Again, it would be completely owned and controlled by you as the business, but it would get into that discipline of separating out your clients' money and paying your suppliers in one pocket and having your free cash in a separate one. That's a good halfway house and a good first step into maybe looking at full trust accounts, but to jump straight from no segregation into a full trust account is a really big step, I think. Last point I wanted to make was, we talked about this before, we've seen a few of our clients go down the route of application for things like BCorp. BCorp aren't the only one out there, but in essence, the feeling is that people increasingly want to work with or do business with businesses they believe in and have taken an ethical stance. BCorp's an interesting one because it isn't just about environment, and I think a large part of the conversation in travel has been about environmental issues, but actually it goes much wider than that. From ethics can include how you treat your supply chain, how you treat customers, what your governance structures are, and how you look after your own employees. And actually BCorp has a very useful checklist you can work through on their website to understand what the requirements would be. And even if you don't intend to go down the route of BCorp, it's a useful exercise just to see what kinds of things you could do to sort of improve and move in that direction. So that was it from me. Just one final word. I'm convinced that what we're living through right now is a rapid contraction in demand, but this is a timing issue as much as anything else. This isn't, we're not Blockbuster Video looking at Netflix coming down the road and thinking our business is finished and the product is defunct. It's a timing issue, all over the world. Certainly I'm having conversations with people all the time who are excited about getting back to travel. They're still planning their bucket lists. They're still looking at where they want to go next. They're still enthused by it. And so really this mindset I think we all have to be in is we've just got to stay around long enough for the resurgence to happen and catch the wave back out again. And some of this risk management stuff is very important, but really it is about just hanging on in there until things will improve. And they will improve. It's just a question of, like I say, when and not if. So that's it from me. Back to you, Chris. Very happy to take any questions or wrap up at the end.
Thanks for that, Martin. I know things are far from rosy in the industry, but it's reassuring to see some seeds of positivity coming through. I mean, you talked about managing risk and building trust, and you gave us some useful points on how that can be done. Are you seeing the industry adapting quickly at the moment, or has it been a gradual realisation over the last few weeks?
Yeah, a difficult one. I think in different ways, there's definitely, it's quite an innovative industry, and so you are seeing insurance products coming out to look at protecting various risks in that chain. Whether that be the agent's commission risk or like new travel insurance products, specifically with this COVID cover. Abs has launched something like that. So I think from that perspective, there are things happening. I do think, though, for the last few months, most people have just been focused on the firefight, doing what they can to survive. So my biggest fear, if I was to sum it up, I think is this: it feels a little bit like this sleepwalk into a cliff edge. And I don't think we can solve that without the help of government or without some coalition of government and trade organisations working together to come up with something. And exactly what that looks like, I know there are some conversations going on, but exactly what that looks like, it's hard to say. Very challenging ahead, though.
Yeah, absolutely. But I guess, the key is that it's not too late to take steps to adapt and to manage and mitigate risks from these challenges.
Probably from what I've seen, smaller businesses generally are a bit more nimble and are able to mothball and save costs more quickly. If you're a cruise line, well, like sadly we saw with CMV last week, it's very expensive to mothball a cruise line. If nobody's using your product, you still got a lot of costs to bear. So it is in some respects a bit more easy for a small business, but certainly it's still a challenge.
Great, thank you. And we'll come back to you if there are any more questions. But just moving on to Farina, thanks for joining us this morning. When we last spoke, Farina, the government had just announced about air corridors. Well, it was a much anticipated announcement. What's been the reaction of your clients? And generally, have these been helpful to them, or are they actually causing some complications in a lot of places?
I definitely think, hello everyone, sorry I was a bit late joining. I definitely think that it's resulted in increased bookings. So I've had a lot of clients report back, and don't get me wrong, it is more of a trickle than a flood, but it's definitely resulted in an increase in bookings. And I know a few people personally that have travelled as a result of the air corridors being introduced, or the travel bridges being introduced. There is absolutely some confusion out there, and I think that's only, I think if you look at the way it's been done, when you go on the FCO website, it still has a big statement at the very beginning, on the homepage, saying there is an advisory in place against non-essential travel, and then kind of added on at the end, it's but there are some exemptions now, and then you have to click on that, and then you have to go through the exemptions, and you need to work out then whether there is an exemption in place. But it's not just whether we can travel there and the FCO advisory allows us to, it's whether they'll accept us and whether we'll have to quarantine on the other side. So it's very easy to see why there is so much confusion. And it's not, I don't think it's helpful in the way that the FCO has sort of positioned it. And I certainly don't think it's helpful that there is still this wording about that, what appears to be a blanket FCO advisory against travel, and then sort of a little sort of afterthought of, but there are some exemptions.
And Martin mentioned obviously that we're expecting an update on Monday, but I think from my understanding, the update is simply maybe adjustments in the air corridors. It doesn't sound like the general advice will change. Is that your expectation?
I think so, yeah, I think so. And I think whilst there remains that advisory, that blanket advisory in place, even with exemptions, it's going to put people off booking.
I mean, earlier this week, we did have, some positive news from the government and the CAA, in that they confirmed that refund credit notes are protected up to 30 September 2021. And this again was another much anticipated announcement. But did you actually think that this changed anything from the advice that you've given previously, or was it just a clarification on something we already knew?
Definitely the latter. So, for me, when I saw it, I just thought, yeah, they've confirmed something that we all knew back in March. And it's great of them to now come on board and confirm that especially, I guess, it's great to be able to confirm that the advice that has been given is correct. Obviously, the advice that I've been given is that I think that they will be ATOL protected and that they should be ATOL protected if you look at the wording of the relevant wording. But obviously, it's always had to be subject to a caveat which says, but until the CAA come out and confirm that it is a risk area. So it's great that we don't have to add that caveat anymore. But I think the crucial element is that the refund credit notes, yes, they will be ATOL protected, but they don't replace a cash refund. If a customer wants a cash refund, they are entitled to that. And you can't impose a refund credit note on a customer when they've asked for a cash refund, irrespective of whether it's ATOL protected or not. So again, you just want to be careful in terms of how you sort of portray the news to customers, and you certainly shouldn't be saying to customers that, ATOL and the government have now confirmed that, refund credit notes are fine to offer instead of cash refunds, because that isn't the case.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we've talked on previous webinars about the CMAs approach to the industry. And I know in the last couple of weeks, they issued an open letter to the travel industry highlighting their concerns on the lack of refunds. And, initially you think, well, maybe is the government's announcement on refund credits going to relax that position? But I mean, do you think that's the case, or do you think they will still be pushing?
I think they'll still be pushing. I think everybody knew this was the case anyway, and you could see it through the failures that were happening and the fact that ATOL was protecting those refund credit notes. You could see it from the fact that there is explicit wording in the ATOL standard terms that makes it clear that if you have a cancelled booking at the time an ATOL holder fails, the ATOL scheme will still protect that cancelled booking. So I don't actually think it changes anything with the CMA's approach. They sent that open letter. It was received by around 200 odd clients. It was received by clients of mine. They sent it over. If you look at it, that it doesn't need a response. It isn't saying, it isn't, my advice was, it's not saying in relation to you specifically, they're going to start enforcement proceedings. It's not saying that it wants a response from you to sort of explain your position. It's basically, in my opinion, putting you on notice that if you have outstanding refund credit notes or just credit notes, start paying them. That's what I've taken from that CMA notice. I think they feel as though, we've given, 4 or 5 months. We'll probably give you another couple of months before we start seriously thinking about enforcement action, maybe. That's what I took from that. So I think my advice there is, if you have outstanding refund credit notes, I don't, we've always had this discussion around how long can you have a refund credit note for? How long can you say, if you don't book within this period, you'll get a cash refund? And I think probably what the CMA is suggesting is you've got a 6-month-ish cutoff. Obviously, don't get me wrong, I'm making assumptions based on what I've read in the letter and other things I've read and heard and discussed. It could be wrong, but I think the CMA is basically saying it's putting the spotlight on the industry.
Yeah, and I guess, the amount of complaints that they've had, they couldn't just ignore the issue. They had to address it some way.
Yeah. And I think we should take it seriously.
Okay, thank you. And Martin raised a point in his slides about this cliff edge in September, and particularly the current kind of protection from the insolvency law. I don't know if you were able to come back on that point to him, and you know whether you are expecting that cliff edge at the end of September when that protection is removed.
Possibly. I think the thing to remember is legal action is not an easy step to take. It in itself takes a long time to get to a stage where you're able to get a statutory demand or a petition for winding up. You've got to go through an entire court process to get to that stage. So, and it costs money. And so I think I'm not expecting it to suddenly be, you know, to suddenly there be this avalanche of staff demands and winding up petitions because of that. And what you have to remember is the courts have been hugely affected by having to close down during the lockdown. There is a huge backlog of existing claims that need dealing with before they can even start looking at new claims. It isn't a quick process, and so I wouldn't say that I'm expecting there to see, you know, huge developments in that area soon.
Okay, thank you for that, and thanks for joining us. I know things are still incredibly busy for you. Next, we have our guest speaker, Chris Wright, Managing Director of Sunvil. Chris has been a part of Sunvil for over 20 years and has been Managing Director since 2013. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the company, but it's been around for a long time, 50 years, specialising in Greece and Cyprus. And Chris actually currently joins us from Corfu. Thank you for joining us today, Chris.
No problem. Good morning, everybody.
And so, most importantly, how's the weather?
Yeah, really hot. I think it's about 32, 33 today, and bright blue skies. So all good.
Oh, that's great. I mean, we'll talk about your trip in a few moments, but obviously we've all had a difficult few months, and the word unprecedented has been used a lot. How did your customers react to the crisis in terms of, you know, did it incur a lot of cancellations, or were people happy to defer their bookings to later in the year or next year?
It was a really interesting one. We started off initially with probably about 90% of people deferring. There was about 2.5% taking refund credit notes, and the other 2.5% taking wanting cash refunds. And that carried on for probably about the first couple of weeks. And then as the press coverage over the refund credit note issue and demand your cash refund sort of escalated, then we saw a deterioration in that. And over the next few weeks, we dropped to about 70% deferral, and then the balance, the majority of it was wanting cash refunds, and there was just a small element that was willing to accept the refund credit note. So predominantly, I think the news coverage really eroded the trust in the refund credit notes, and that was really what pushed it towards the cash refunds there. In general, the majority of our customers that travel with us year on year, we've got a lot of repeat bookers, and it was those that were more inclined to defer because a lot of them do automatically rebook year on year anyway. So they were quite comfortable and happy to defer, and it was more the ones that sort of had only booked with us for the first time that were wanting the cash refunds, and they were the ones that were more difficult to persuade to defer. So a real mixed bag, really.
And I guess it just shows, you know, the impact of the delay in the CAA and government's advice really on the business there, which is, you know, I know obviously your chair, Noel Josephidis, has expressed a lot of frustration about that in the media, and it just goes to show, you know, the impact there. Completely.
And even some long-standing clients that we'd initially persuaded to take a refund credit note, they were quite happy with it. And then they just, even though they trust us profusely, they just weren't willing to accept them, and sort of did a complete U-turn based on the coverage that was coming out. And it was just so frustrating. And you could see the sort of the angst in their email dialogue, in that they really wanted to assist us, but they just didn't trust it on the basis of what they were reading in the press.
Yeah, absolutely. And are you seeing signs of improvements now, just in terms of obviously customers wanting to travel now that travel has opened up over the last few weeks, and in terms of new bookings?
Yeah, it's I think trickle is the word of the day at the moment, and it really is a trickle. We had an initial burst after the travel corridors were announced, and there was quite a bit of pent up demand there, and then that's sort of subsided now, and it really is a handful of bookings each day. But we're seeing, we've been quite heavy on our social media campaigns, emails, newsletters, and trying to get reports back from overseas, and that's certainly helping in trying to rebuild confidence there. And I think it was Farina mentioned earlier about the FCO advice. Even though things have changed, the fact that there are still banner ads there saying we advise all but essential travel, and some of the country advice is still incorrect. I know, just talking about Greece, it still says on the Greece pages that if you're selected for testing on arrival, that you have to self-isolate for 24 hours pending the results of the test coming back, and that's completely not the case. And we've been battling with the FCO for the last 3 weeks now to try and get that changed, and they're just so slow at moving, and they just don't really have an understanding as to how much of a problem that causes with confidence. So it's a real battle in trying to restore that confidence. But slowly it's coming back. All the reports that are coming back from sort of normal people that are traveling, and as they report back that it's all fine and there's no issues, I think slowly that trust will come back, and people will start to travel. We've got quite an older client base, and I know, talking to my own parents and my own in-laws who are in their 70s, they're still concerned about traveling, and they're normally the first ones that say, well, it's your flight, and I know you'll look after us, so we're quite happy to travel. And so if even they're sort of reluctant at the moment, you can see why the wider market still has a few trust issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's clear that obviously the social media post that you're doing is helping. I mean, you've traveled to Greece twice in the last few weeks, I understand. I mean, how did you find the experience, and how is this helping you to kind of give reassurance to your customers?
So back on the 3rd of July was the first one, and that was before direct flights were allowed back into Greece. So I ended up flying from Luton to Poland, and then connecting on from Poland to Corfu. The whole journey, I think, was only £45, which was quite an eye opener. But it was fine, and it was a real, I suppose, having not left my kitchen virtually for 3 months, it was quite a shock to the system. And one of the things I'm recommending to our guests now is the whole getting used to wearing a mask for a long period of time, because I think out of all of it, that was the main thing that I took away from it. It was the fact that after putting the mask on the coach to the airport, and wearing it around the terminal, it felt quite alien for the first hour, and then really you forgot it was there, and you didn't take any more notice of it. And then the other thing really was, I had a real step change when I realized that I could only control me, and I could only make sure that I was protected and I was doing everything that I should be doing, and you can't really control anybody that's around you. So when you're in a queue and people don't social distance, or when you're sat on the aircraft and the person next to you may take their mask off, I think there's not a lot that you can do about that, and you have to sort of relax into the notion that you've got your mask on, you've got your hand sanitizer and your wipes, and you're sanitizing everything. And once you sort of relax into that train of thought, then it all becomes, it's not a pleasurable journey, but it really isn't as bad as you sort of make it out in your own head. We had our own first direct flight last week. I travelled out on Monday to Corfu from Gatwick, and things are really starting to sort of come back to a bit more normal in the airports. Gatwick, everything's being channeled through the North Terminal. There's quite a lot of shopping outlets reopened now. Pret-a-manger reopened over the weekend. So you're starting to see things returning to normal, and whilst there's not the sort of the normal flow of passengers, it's quite quiet. At least you can sort of buy things at the airport. You can buy duty free, you can buy food if you want to, and so it's starting to feel a bit more like the old journey, really. The other takeaway really was I know hand baggage has been mentioned quite a lot as an issue, and it really sort of struck home why it's good to limit the hand baggage. It sort of eases the journey through security when you haven't got to unpack a lot of bags and that sort of thing. And then when you get on board, if you've only got a small handbag, you can just sort of literally slip it under the seat in front of you without having to sort of get up and use overhead lockers. And so it eases the boarding process. And it's all those sort of things really that when we can report those back to our customers, it's almost like providing a Q&A where you can try and think of the questions that are going through their own heads before they travel, and answer those questions before they have to experience it, to make the whole thing easier and less sort of confusing for them, and more of a relaxed process.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do wonder whether the fact that we'll have to wear masks a lot more in this country from tomorrow, whether that will kind of help people get used to them. I know a lot of people are concerned about border control, both, you know, on their way into the country and back in the UK as well. What was your experience of that?
So coming into Greece specifically, there is a passenger location form that you have to fill out up to 24 hours before departure. And it's quite an easy form to fill out. You do one per adult, and you can add the kids onto one of the adults. And then literally that gets submitted. And then on the evening before departure, you get sent through a QR code, which then you have to take with you. You show it at the airport. You can't check in until you've shown that you've got it. And then when you arrive in Greece, they look at the code, and depending on which code you've got, you either get sent for a quick test, or you're allowed to proceed as normal. But even those that are sent for the quick test, it's a swab in the back of the throat through the mouth, and you're normally back to baggage reclaim before the cases have come up. And that's again the issue with the FCO advice, in that literally once you've had the swab, you can carry on with your holiday as planned, and it's only if you get contacted to say that the test has come back positive that you need to do anything about it. And no Brits, as far as I'm aware, going into Greece at the moment have actually tested positive. So the whole sort of experience is very well managed. There's no queues. It's just the normal experience that you would get on arrival, and it's literally just a handful of people off each flight are diverted for a quick test. Coming back into the UK is a slightly more haphazard experience. The first time I came back from Greece, I came back in on the day that quarantine had been lifted, and in my own head, I thought that meant that I didn't have to fill out any forms, because I was coming back in from a quarantine-free area. But the reality was, you do have to fill out the passenger location form, and it's a lot more complicated than the Greek one. And then the laughable part about it all is that you arrived back, and there was 3 or 4 border control people trying to rugby tackle people to try and catch everybody as they came through, and the vast majority of people were just walking through and passing them and didn't even have their forms checked. So it's a bit of a different experience when you're arriving back into the UK, and really highlights why the whole quarantine thing is a complete farce that should never have been introduced.
Yeah, absolutely. I know a lot of people share that thought. I do believe, I think it's got better in the UK now. I guess you haven't experienced the journey back yet, but hopefully maybe next time when you come back into the UK, it will be slightly better. But yeah, who knows? It's a tricky one.
Yes, yeah, I'm sure. I mean, and all these things are evolving all the time, and people that share a bad experience one day, the next day the experience can be completely changed, and we have to take that into account. I've joined up to quite a few Facebook groups, destination-led Facebook groups, that people are asking questions, and it's amazing how informed you become, sort of looking at the questions that people are asking, and everybody's experience is very different, and the more experiences, I suppose, that get fed back, things get improved all the time.
I think, you know, that you've been blogging about your recent travels, and I think some of your reps as well on the Sunvil website. What's been your customers' reaction to that? Has it helped to build their confidence?
It's helped hugely, and we forget as people that are involved in travel. I mean, for the since March, a lot of us have been involved in the whole thing 24/7, and you forget that the general customer may not be watching the news, may not be looking at the FCO advice, and they don't know the ins and outs of what's going on. And even this morning, one of the team called me up to say that Mrs. Smith had phoned up and was enthralled that we'd sent out the email newsletter yesterday, because she was convinced she couldn't travel anywhere this year. And so it's all about continually pushing that message and remembering that the customer doesn't always know what's going on, and the more times you can tell them that travel's restarting, and that the experience isn't as bad as you may have thought in your head, then the more times we can do that, the more chance we get of getting people back traveling again.
Absolutely. And you know, a lot of our members have seen an increase in inquiries, and it's just turning that inquiry into a booking. I mean, what key actions and steps are you taking to secure bookings at the minute, to turn them around?
The interesting thing is I jumped on the phones, I think it was Tuesday this week, because we had horrendous call waiting times, and in the 2 hours that I was on the phones, I probably talked to 6 different bookings where they wanted to cancel, and just being able to have that conversation and saying I was actually sat here in Corfu, and that it wasn't really the same as they were running through in their head, that I managed to turn those bookings round, and they ended up saying, okay, we'll go ahead, we'll pay you the balance, and we'll go ahead with the holiday on that basis. And similarly with some new inquiries that have come through, we managed to have that conversation, and I know the teams have been talking and saying, our MD's on the ground, this is the experience that he's had. We had a Zoom call with our reps this morning, and they've said this. And that's really been the step change in converting those bookings and turning them from inquiries into bookings. And the more we can do that, I think the easier it'll become.
Well, that's great news. I think they'll have you on the phones more often by the sounds of it. Well, thank you so much for dialing in today and for letting us know about your experience. It's been really helpful, and also really helpful to hear how that's giving your customers the confidence to make those bookings and to travel. Thanks for taking the time on that.
No problem.
And thank you to all our panelists. It's been a really helpful discussion. Hopefully it's provided our members with some useful tips to, for us to keep bouncing back. The recording and the slides and details of our next webinar will be circulated shortly. But in the meantime, thank you everyone for joining us, and have a great day.